to Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl. He is the Omar Esmeralda Alfi Professor of Islamic Law at the UCLA School of Law. He's an accomplished author. He's written on the field of Islamic law, but he also engages in human rights law, international law. He's been doing this for maybe 20 years, more than 20 years. He's also a product of this institution, the Near Eastern Studies Department. He got his PhD here. Anything else you want to add?
It was wonderful.
That was great.
Good job.
The graduate students already had their opportunity to engage, so you could ask anything about anything. It doesn't have to be intellectual. It doesn't have to be scholarly. It doesn't. So don't worry about sounding too elementary or simple or anything like that.
So like you've stated that you'd like to return to the golden age of Islam, where numerous traditions emphasize the pursuit of knowledge as an act of permanent worship, and to abandon the current state of affairs where rampant apologetics of Muslim thinkers has produced a culture that eschews self-critical and introspective insight and embraces projection of blame and a fantasy-like level of confidence and arrogance. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but Ustad Mahmoud Muhammad Taha from Sudan once stated that the second Islamic golden age will come with the coming of the Mahdi. So would you agree with this statement, or would you say that it's possible for Muslims today to usher in a new Islamic golden age, and if so, what would it take?
I have to tell you, I don't believe in golden ages. I just think that's understanding history as yielding a golden age is dangerous because it creates dichotomies in people's mind and creates considerable amount of defeatism. And the biggest problem in believing in an unadulterated so-called golden age is that people learn to marginalize whatever is idealistic and unreachable. So if you, and this happens, so many Muslims, because they've learned to the history of the Sahaba, for instance, as a golden age, they feel defeated before they even start, or they try to replicate what they believe was the utopia of the Sahaba. And there is no way that you can produce utopias without breaking the metal of human psychology. Human beings are not perfect beings, and they are not angels. And if you try to make them into angels, you're very likely to actually turn them into demons. Yes, I believe that historically the status of Muslims economically, scientifically, intellectually was much better than our day and age. I even might say that in many ways I believe these are the darkest ages that Muslims lived through. But there's a world of difference between saying that in a relative, using certain measures of comparison to say, this historical period, we were better off than this historical period, and to believe in a golden age. Now, the other thing is that I know that among contemporary Muslims, the belief in the Mahdi is widespread, and the belief in the Mahdi does tend to spread every time there is a major crisis that Muslims, not just Muslims, all religious groups live through. People await a mukhallis, a liberator, in a form of hero worship. That someone will come, and that's a very common theme in human history. I mean, the books on Fitan and the Mahdi tended to proliferate during the Crusades. The First Crusade, it exploded during the Mongol invasion and the sacking of Baghdad. It exploded. Theologically, I don't believe in a Mahdi. I don't believe in an antichrist, and I don't believe in a Mahdi. And I don't think it's supported by either the Quran or Islamic theology. I do believe in Yawm al-Qiyamah, and I'll just put it simply, if the Mahdi was such an important element in Islamic theology, I think Allah would have made it clear in the Quran, and Allah didn't. So that's a basic and fundamental disagreement with Taha. I have other disagreements with him, but I'll add just this one other element, is that the people who exacerbate me the most among Muslims, because I mean there are a lot of people that exacerbate me, but among Muslims, are the ones who seem to be largely apathetic, because when you try to convince them to do anything, their response is, well, the Prophet ﷺ said that near the end of times, my ummah will shrink back and become, Muslims will become persecuted on the earth, and Islam will shrink back to Mecca, and so this has all been foretold, and there is nothing that you could do because this is the way it is. And I just think that I mean there's so many levels that I disagree with it, but if you think of from the perspective of people that I engage quite often, the Islamophobes, you couldn't possibly give them a greater gift than this type of apathetic, deterministic view of history as inevitably leading to a collapse of everything Muslim. And it's contrary to the very philosophy of creation. If Allah meant us to die before we die, I think we wouldn't be able to make sense of why Allah created us in the first place. So.
During the Khutbah today, you mentioned that since, I forget the exact date, but 12.5 million Muslims have died in recent
20
history.
years.
20 years. A lot.
The article said 25, but when I looked at the history, that's wrong, it's 20 years.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate that like a good proportion, perhaps even the majority of those deaths have been caused by other Muslims. When you see the events happening in Yemen or Syria, or with the rise of ISIS and the fall of ISIS afterwards, do you think that there's something inherent in Islam that makes us more inclined to be violent towards each other? Or do you think this is something that Islam has no relationship with, but is just kind of part of human nature to first come into conflict with the people that are right next to you before?
I mean, it's a good question. It's not just Muslims that have had a knack for slaughtering each other. If you look at European history, it's extremely bloody, and Europeans have slaughtered each other plenty of times. So if you're looking at people who've killed each other the most, I think you'll find history quite messy. What we do find is that foreign invasions and political powerlessness polarizes societies and turn defeated people. It's like, when you put mice in a crowded area and you electrify the borders, they immediately start attacking each other. High stress, and at the same social level, the results are the same. High stress makes people polarize and attack each other. And in the case of Muslims, that there is no cure like success, and then for everyone, no cure like success and prosperity, and no illness like defeat and lack of prosperity. So I don't think it's a coincidence that consistent French, we mentioned Africa, consistent interventions by the French in Africa, or by the Dutch in Africa, has created a bloodbath. I don't think it's a coincidence that consistent interventions by the French and British and Americans in the Middle East. I don't think that it's a coincidence that ISIS arose after not just the American invasion, but after the failure of the world to support the democratic aspirations of native people in the region during the Arab Spring. I mean, I can tell you from my experience with people in the State Department, with people who have, from the American side of government, during the Obama administration, there was a critical discussion as to whether to support, to back up democratic aspirations in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates played a critical role in convincing the Obama administration not to, and to help them in undermining whatever democratic aspirations are in the Middle East. And I think it was entirely predictable that what will follow will be a bloodbath. Because what do people do when they hate who rules them and they have no way of instituting change and no way of fixing society other than to ask people to be just perpetually victimized and subjugated? It's a tall order. It's not realistic. So no, I don't. In fact, Islamic theology, you talk about literalists, and this is a very interesting example. You want to take strict constructionists, people who read strict constructionism, the sort of legal school that says that you read what the literal text says and it tells you what the law is, right? So you have a hadith from the Prophet that says whoever kills a Muslim is in hellfire regardless of the reason, and who, even if you kill a Muslim, in the qatil and maqtul are in hellfire. Both the killer and the killed, if they went to war, are both in hellfire. And this hadith has been authenticated. I think it would be fair that it reaches the level of mutawatir, meaning indisputable authenticity. And it couldn't be more literal and obvious in meaning. It doesn't talk about exceptions. It doesn't allow for anything. It doesn't, it basically says if you go to war with a fellow Muslim, even if you're killed intending to kill the other, too bad. Both of you are going to hellfire. Now, take a very literalist school like the Wahhabi school. What do they do with a hadith like that? I mean, that tells you something about the role or the way that the text can be ignored. So the same school that will have epileptic fits if a woman doesn't cover her hair because they claim it's very textually clear, will conveniently ignore a genocide in Yemen and not be troubled by it. It doesn't mean the text is irrelevant, but it tells us that there is much more than just the religious text that goes on when human beings make choices as to what to interpret and how to interpret it. Teresa?
It's okay. I didn't think it was appropriate to ask about it yesterday, but I've been approached many times to speak about, from a theological perspective, Islamic stances on supersessionism. And Michael Cook gave a famous paper once saying that there is no supersessionism in Islam, that Islam as a religion is suprasessionist, meaning it doesn't believe that there is an updating of religious, but that, Islam calls you back to the original. So I was wondering what you think, especially given political questions in the 20th and 21st century about the relationship of different faiths. What is your theological?
Yeah, that's you remind me of when I was a graduate student at Princeton. I once heard a conversation. It was Michael Cook and Bernard Lewis, and I was the managing editor of Princeton Papers, and so that's why I was present in the conversation. And they were talking about whether it is possible for Islam to have, or for Muslims to have a forward view of history, meaning to believe that history can evolve progressively so that, for instance, for a pious Muslim to believe that it is possible to achieve better than what the companions of the Prophet achieved. And that's very much like and of course the conclusion of their conversation was that no, it's impossible. That and I have to admit that that conversation made me do a lot of research and a lot of thinking because and especially rereading the text about whether the literature on fitan is sort of and the futur al-Sharia, the sort of the eventual death of Sharia, because in the late periods all the ulama will die and there will be no longer ulama and so on, is to what extent is it ingrained in the fabric of the religion itself. And I don't know to what extent as a lawyer, I'm always tempted to want to rely on precedent and claim that I have precedential authority because you're very uncomfortable doing what philosophers do and reasoning without authority and so on. But on this issue, I will resist my lawyerly inclinations and tell you, theologically, I think that it is a very dangerous thing to believe in a largely reactionary understanding of history and to believe that history is even circular, because history is not cyclical and it is not circular. And human beings do progress, and I can make and I think I've done it in some articles, but a lot more to do. I make an hermeneutically anchored argument that, in fact, the only way to understand the text of the Quran is that the nature of creation is constant movement, and that the idea that the logic of nature which would reject stagnation, and the minute there is lack of movement, it deteriorates and becomes undone, and we start moving towards oblivion. The nature of energy and light is movement, and that informs a lot of my understanding of history. And I, at this point, say that I do accept supersession, and that I don't believe that the highly idealistic understanding of the life of the companions have done us any good. They were not as ideal as we like to think they are, and that doesn't impeach them. They were human beings, and they did their very best. And we can do as well and better if, depending on the resources that are available to us. And the fact is, we can, if we can take care of each other as human beings in ways that technology enables us. And how can we ignore that in our theology? I mean, how can we ignore the fact that science enables us to help human beings in ways that were unimaginable 1,000 years ago, and not incorporate that within our theological understanding of the religion? And I've actually written this part, that any serious Muslim theologian in our day and age has to be a product of the epistemology of the current times, and talking while taking account of all these factors is being a product of our epistemological mind. A theologian that still talks simply in terms of the Quran and Sunnah, as if there is no science and there is no knowledge, and that interacts and engages the text of the Quran and Sunnah, is part of the problem. I mean, it's part of the reason that Muslims continue to do great injustice by their religion. I mean, I hate to speak somewhat dogmatically, but it's a beautiful faith, brilliantly enlightening and liberating ideas, that is served by a highly subjugated and dominated people that don't do that faith justice, and don't do the intellectual tradition of that faith justice, and have not engaged it or developed it. So, yeah.
Going into that, what will be the solution? What's the way out in your قراءة?
I believe that, I've said this in writing and in lectures, and the jihad of our age is a jihad of information, data, and knowledge. If someone wants to do real jihad, learning something like computer science, that's the instrument of our age. That's the power of our age. Nothing gets done without computers today. Learning how to engage analytically, or learning the hermeneutics of today, that's the jihad of the age. I know a lot of Muslims don't encourage their kids to study philosophy, but the value of a Muslim philosopher in this day and age, most Muslims become so alienated from their community that, because I actually had a classmate, not a classmate, but when I was at Princeton, there was a Princetonian undergraduate who majored in philosophy and then went to Harvard to get a doctorate in philosophy. And as typical, they didn't stay with Islam because they felt very alienated by fellow Muslims. And it's a brilliant mind that we lost. And and it's because the community was not willing to put up with the flights, the various excesses of a philosophical mind. The philosophical mind has to be able to be incorrect 50% of the time at least, and say silly things 50% of the time, and go up and down and left and right, and be moody, and good mood, bad mood, crazy mood, same mood, so on. That's the nature of it. But we lose a lot when we don't put up with that. And so the only solution, that I can see is that investment in educational institutions. If I had the resources, if Allah would have, I can't play the lottery because it's haram, but if Allah would just give me the lottery anyway, which reaches something like $130 million in California. I don't know what it is here, but you can become very, very rich if you play the lottery in California. Well, of course, if you anyway, creating something, and of course my field is I would create a Muslim law school, a law school that actually produces Muslim judges and lawyers and senators and congressmen. And the funny thing is that whatever Muslim intellectuals write and publish in the West, it will filter back to the Muslim world far more effectively than if it was written in the Muslim world, because it is al-Nabi.
This is absolutely correct. And if you allow me, I was trying to, you were answering a lot of questions which I've been there the past 60 years trying to find answers to, or trying to find the lead way to. I was told one from the very, very top political people in the Middle East. Khaled, if you want to do anything to change here, it starts from the West. That's absolutely correct and what you're saying. So here we are in Princeton, the most highest intellectual persons, and looking back in history, or what I know of Princeton, King of Morocco is from here, the Queen of Jordan is from here. One of you guys will be the Prime Minister of this country. One of them will be his Department of State. Rumsfeld, who killed all these people in Iraq, was from here. What should we do for that brilliant crowd here? What are the baby steps which we should do as grown-ups in this community here to help educate them, to help find some resources, or to guide, or whatever it is? I don't know. There is something which is there, but I don't know what it is. But there is a very big value for this group in this room, and big hope.
You're absolutely, and this informed the khutbah that I gave as well. That
yes.
There is an Arabic word, ihtiwa. I don't know what the English equivalent would be. It's not containment, obviously. It's caretaking. What I experience as a teacher, because as an academic, I see what happens to young Muslims as they grow up and go into the professional field and so on. The rate of attrition, and this is directed at all you guys who are, especially the undergraduates, the rate of attrition is way too high. Too many brilliant Muslim minds, too many Muslims no longer feel comfortable being anchored within the Muslim identity as they go into their professional life. So in this regard, the role that people like Sahib play are so critical in drawing people in, but it is also critical that we create forums in which the contributions of young Muslims, that they would feel supported and celebrated and encouraged, so that they remain anchored within a Muslim affiliation as they go about in life. Because the temptations that are going to be attracting them to melt into a white type privilege, and to even be ashamed of even their race, their ethnicity, their identity, their whatever constructs their self-awareness, are going to be so high and enormous. There's of course there's for Muslims that are going to you know that if whatever a Muslim intellectual in the American academia writes, just because it's published in the West, it becomes cool and fashionable for academics back home to adopt and talk about, and the fact that this comes from a Western press and so on. So whatever, I mean, when we have a group of Egyptian professionals in California, and when they say, you know, what can we do? I tell them, if you really want to make a difference, support serious studies on, if Egypt is your thing, support serious studies on Egypt, so that people who do the type of critical work that actually can make a difference in Egypt's future, in economics and politics, and will find funding, will find postdocs, will find fellowships, because compare an academic doing work on Israel to an academic doing work on the entire Muslim world to put together. An academic doing work on Israel has so many opportunities of funding, it's really ridiculous. The comparison is just ridiculous, considering that we're 1.6 billion Muslims. While I don't know if any of you had the great pleasure of trying to see how many fellowships and postdocs exist available for Muslims. Very little, very few.
Raisa and I
Have that experience. Yeah, it's embarrassing. I mean, it is. We still act like backwards people that would rather build mosques than create a postdoc. That's the way backwards people think.
Yeah. So like, returning to the topic of the renewal of religion and studying in the West, and also a few hadiths. So like, there's a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. I'm not sure what the hadith is, but Arabic, in English, it's faith will ascend to the Pleiades, and a man of Persian descent will bring it back to earth. So like, could this be referring to Imam al-Ghazali? And then, since you don't believe in the idea of a Mahdi, do you at least believe in the idea of a Mujaddid? Or in English, renewal of faith? And also, since you don't believe in the Mahdi, are the hadith on the Mahdi, in your opinion, allegorical, or are they fabricated? And also, I just wanted to mention that there's another hadith that I found on the Yahya Harun website, but I know like it's not really viewed favorably. That says that the Mahdi will not leave Rome. So could Rome like be referring to the West or like Western institutions, in your opinion? Yeah.
Okay. I think I do believe a lot of the hadith of fitan and the hadith of the Mahdi are of dubious authenticity. There's a long reason for that, but the short version of it is that a lot of these hadiths came in with converts and to Islam after the first century, and that brought in a lot of their traditions, and comparative work on comparative texts reveals similarities that are too much of coincidence. The other thing is that a lot of ahadith, the politically motivated ahadith, the ahadith that we know played a role in sectarian conflicts between Shia and Sunnah, or ahadith that played a role between the Amalids and their opponents, or the Abbasids and the rebels against them, have very problematic origins. The Mujaddid hadith it doesn't reach the level of tawatur. It is an hadith. However, I do believe it is probably does reflect something that the Prophet said. Whether, do I believe that I count every 100 years for the appearance of a Mujaddid? No, but I understand that it is a part of the idea of progress and movement and the supersession. Although I wish it was a mutawatir hadith so that I can point to it and say, look, there has to be renewal and tajdeed, but it's not. So I can just point to it as persuasive evidence, as part of a whole argument. Now, I have to tell you that my skin crawls when Sudais calls MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi, the Mujaddid of Islam. I don't think that, I think the Prophet turns in his grave. And the fact that this is a Qari Quran and a Hafiz Quran and an Imam of the Haram and all of that, and maybe that's why Allah willed that this is not a mutawatir hadith, so that because Allah knew that there will be Sudais is going to use it and try to use it. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, you have to, again, it illustrates how dangerous these historically deterministic, even that level, which is not entirely deterministic. I mean, when you think about it, just now the more specific questions about interpreting the ahadith that are part of the Mahdi tradition, that would get us, I think, into areas that might not be of let's leave that, because I think that's a bit too specialized.
Okay. Yeah, so,
Can we let others have that?
oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, but, I was just gonna, interject about something that you mentioned.
No, just
complete
your thought.
Okay, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you mentioned that, you have doubts about the whole concept of the Mahdi, because, it's found in different religions, and you think that, the concept could have been brought in by converts. So this is just my personal opinion. So please don't take anything of it. But I don't feel that similarities imply that it's wrong, because there are similarities between many religions, and one could even possibly say that this could these similarities could have arisen from the fact that it's said that like God sent prophets to like all the people, and like maybe like the reason that these similarities exist are because of that. And
You know, I don't think the one thing that you know, if those who are convinced by it, fine, you know, we'll all find out in the hereafter. Allah will tell us.
Yeah. So I think like on the opposite end of Muslims completely leaving the faith and identity of being Muslim is like going into these sorts of like fields of knowledge and kind of remaining Muslim but redefining Muslim to be this cultural tradition of like whatever people in Muslim lands have done over, you know, the years, which is like a simplified what is Islam, Shahab Ahmed kind of argument. And so I guess like how do we best make a case like, you know, among whether in the academy or just generally like for the tradition as something that is more defined. And I think both problems that you mentioned in this one stem from our inability to kind of like offer a more expansive definition of what tradition is. But at the same time, there is like a definition that isn't.
You know, this is the two ways of answering this, right? We could enlighten ourselves with the ways that someone like Gadamer, for instance, tried to define tradition, because or the struggles with someone like Martin Buber with the Jewish tradition, and reading comparative work can help us a great deal into seeing the ways that other people have constructed for philosophical or theoretically systematic approaches to what tradition is, and then, you know, we can take or leave. The other really interesting thing is that, do you know one of the most interesting definition of traditions I ever heard was in a rap song. It was in Shirley Jackson's wife, Heather's, what was the name of that rapper, the Muslim convert?
Oh, Baraka Blue?
Yeah, what was his name?
The guy who spoke at the event? Yeah, Baraka.
Baraka Blue. He did a rap, and what is tradition? It's a white convert, but it was one of the most brilliant, not philosophical, but just from a completely literary perspective of how this convert understands tradition. I actually didn't. If he ever hears this, I think he's be shocked, because I didn't even say a word. But it was really. So
he performed that here.
Huh?
He performed that piece here.
Oh, he did? Yes. It's brilliant, quite brilliant. I mean, and it has philosophical layers, maybe more than perhaps he realizes. But anyway. But I completely understand why, because I think approaches like Shahab Ahmed's, or like I read recently an article by what's her name, the woman in the Oxford Handbook, Chaudhry.
Oh, Aisha.
Aisha Chaudhry. That sort of anthropological or / sociological approach to defining a theological legacy, in which basically let's throw out theology, let's throw out textuality, and let's just embrace cultural performance as normatively defining. So instead of culture being even responsive to specific contingencies that arise in history, then these specific contingencies can become generalized into sort of normative definitions of theology. It is very dangerous. I remember in Shahab Ahmad's book, when he, towards the end, when he talks about, so is there Islamic terrorism? And of course, methodologically, he committed himself to say, well, sure, there is, because, he abandons the entire project of theology and the entire project of law. He actually calls law supremacist, which again, it's name calling. It's not really critique. It's, Anyway, so part of the biggest intellectual challenge we have is to negotiate, and our ancestors have confronted the same challenge and produced their own responses, but we in the modern age have not done so convincingly. Part of the biggest challenge is between those who simply point to the body of a corpus within that is defined, and most people are not even aware that text, the Bukhari text or the Muslim text or the Ibn Majah text, is itself, the way that text exists in the modern age is in itself a dynamic, and itself there's a story behind it. But between the challenge of those who point to these texts and say they're in this tradition, and those who find this so suffocating that they say, okay, throw out the text. We don't need the text. And it's, for me, I think it is embarrassing that we are now in 2019, and we're still struggling between, either tradition is text as defined by print, which is, we'll tell you, it's a very fairly recent modern idea. Not even text as defined by makhtutat and handwriting and comparison of manuscripts and so on. We don't even bother with that. It's like whatever the publisher in Lebanon or in Riyadh says is a text, that's a text. Or nothing at all. Without getting into longer discussions about my own struggles with the way I try to define tradition, I think let's leave it at that. But I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and I think that's where we need Muslim intellects, and especially those gifted in philosophy, in political theory, in law, in theology, especially theology, which has a very close blood relation with philosophy and law. I mean, that separation, you can't, I don't know if you can do really theology without studying philosophy and studying law.
No, please. No, please. You're from California, so.
Well, on the theology question, I've sort of recently been just kind of dabbling in critical theory and kind of seeing what those thinkers have to say about questions and issues and stuff. I don't understand it much, to be honest, but a recurrent theme is the idea that metaphysics is dead, and it's like shunning ontology anytime the sort of issue of ontology comes up. And I do feel a pull towards those ideas, and I was wondering whether what you thought about that sort of intellectual tradition has to say about theology.
There's a certain hubris that academics engage in because they often want to make the claim that their findings are so important, so earth-shattering. So, in law, as you know, there's an enormous amount of dictum, stuff that's just said that you don't take very seriously because, in critical legal theory, a lot of the stuff said about metaphysics and the death of ontology is unnecessary for the project of critical legal theory. Critical legal theory, I don't consider a theory of law. It doesn't offer a theory of law. It offers a critique, a methodology for seeing the hidden assumptions that inform law, especially as they relate to the dynamics of power. Power, whether gender, race, in labor relations, and so on, like a lot of folks that have been influenced by Foucault and post-Foucault, they're very good at telling us what's wrong, but they're not good at telling us, okay, what's right, what do we do then? So, I've learned, maybe I've been doing it for too long, but I've learned to sort of not to take these statements, these types of, they become so repetitive that often I must admit that I sometimes even skip sections of books where they start going off about the death of metaphysics, and because it just, you're good at critiques, critical legal theorists. You're not good at metaphysics. You're not good at philosophy. You can allow me to see. You can provide me with a method of criticism, but and that's a great achievement in itself. So.
What I had in mind, I mean, obviously critical legal theory is building on the other like French philosophers and things like that. I was thinking about like the structuralists and the post-structurists who say there's nothing natural in the world and everything is constructed.
Well, again, from every philosophical insight, I don't think I've ever read a philosopher that I slavishly followed, not even Kant, who, if I don't do that was, I don't set my brain aside when I read the Quran, then why should I set my brain aside when I read anyone? And my point in this is that one of the ideas that one of the problems that I have with the folks like Shahab Ahmed or Chaudhry, I forgot her first name again. Aisha Chaudhry. That is precisely that they buy into this sort of post-structuralist argument that, well, everything is constructed, everything is entirely subjective, there is no even ultimate, absolute, objective anything. I would like to see a systematic defense of religious faith if you really buy into that, thoroughly buy into that. What I learned from Foucault is the art of critique, but Gadamer used to, not Gadamer, Derrida used to give lectures at Davis, and you know, he used to, all his devotees would go and they would kiss the ground, they would, you know, walk on pretty much. And like, there was waiting list to meet, and because he was like the prophet of the age, it never did that to me. Never had that, you know, ugly factor in that, you know, wow factor.
Yeah, you know, I have two questions in the short time that's left. Is, you know, one is that for the benefit of myself and the rest of us here who are trying to wrap our minds around your proposed approach to Islamic law in the modern world, I want to give you a case study, which is very personal to me, and that's the case study of adoption. And you know, in my travels in the Muslim world, one of the most disturbing things was the number of children who go begging on the streets without people providing them with shelter under this, you know, so-called fiqhi taboo of adoption. And as you know, my daughter is adopted from an orphanage in Karachi. You know, while 99.9% of everyone I choose to kind of allow in my orbit have been nothing but loving and embracing about it, that 0.1%, you know, who will say, how could you do such a thing? It's haram, right? And there's the approach of the technocrats as opposed to the approach of the more sophisticated, you know, maybe maqasidi approach. And so that's one question. And then a question entirely different, which is, you know, you talked a little bit about why many young Muslims are leaving Islam, and as a chaplain at a university campus, of course, this is like a foremost concern in my mind and that I'm thinking about a lot. But one of the reasons, among many other reasons, is that sometimes, you know, our insistence on, you know, this idea that Islam is submission to the will of God, and the will of God is known through partly through scripture and through revelation. What would you say to a Muslim who struggles when they find something in the revelation, especially in the Quran? Because with hadith, you can do some gymnastics, you know, but with Quran, like when they find something that's so problematic, that's so incongruent with what their soul is telling them, or what their basic beliefs about human virtue are, that they can't submit to that, and then they therefore say, you know, I'd rather find another path, or find something that's more congruent with what I believe.
Well, you know, in some ways, both questions are related. So, you know, the issue of adoption is a really good example, because I know people who've gone in the summer to Egypt or Jordan or Morocco, and they see the number of street children, and then they hear from their parents that no, Islam adoption is haram, and the other thing, of course, is that imams in mosques don't give people a clue as to the amount of emphasis on the duty of taking care of orphans. I mean, if there is a straight way to heaven, it's to take care of orphans, not build a mosque. Because, I mean, the number of times that duty is repeated in the Quran is, it's quite remarkable. And again, it shows you the selectivity in the way we deal with the text. But so from a legal point of view, I mean, what is really interesting about the issue of orphans is that the Quran says, "Ud'uhum li'aba'ihim." And even the language itself, the textual language, is not, the grammatical form is not necessarily it doesn't necessarily create a wajib, but can even be understood grammatically as an advice. And it says basically that so that it is better that they be attributed to their parents. That of course assumes that we know who their parents are. And we know the issues that arise with inheritance and so on. But whatever purposes are achieved, and of course we know the story of the Prophet ﷺ was his adopted son, and whatever social objectives are achieved and moral objectives, and the moral objectives are key, with knowing lineage and lines of lineage and lines of inheritance must be valued with the other moral objective of taking care of orphans. Now, if we reach a point in our Muslim societies where people are not taking care of orphans, using the so-called the laws of lineage and inheritance as an excuse, how could there be a more pressing need for a legal change? I mean, because anyone that goes to the Muslim world that sees the amount of street children in a place like Egypt and the way people treat orphans, I mean, if people really cared about text, the emphasis in hadith and Quran about that if you mistreat an orphan, you basically have no hope of salvation. And if you want hope of salvation, you take care of orphans. So if the issue is really, the problem is that they just don't want to give orphans their names. So why don't you take care of orphans, let them have their own names, don't give them your names, but raise them equal to your children. If people were truly pious, if that was truly the issue. But it immediately, for a good jurist, and notice here, it's sort of a being ferocious in taking a moral inventory of truth, calling things as they are. You have a serious social problem, you have this issue of lineage, you have people using as an excuse the law of lineage to not take care of orphans, which is a pressing moral objective in itself. What is the science of tarjih about if it's not about evaluating the various objectives of Sharia and then coming to a conclusion that we need to take care of orphans? We need to do whatever is necessary to have orphans taken care of. If that, the issue of having to suspend the questions of lineage because we have a higher moral objective, and that is all the orphans are street kids that are then sex trafficked. And here again, a jurist who lives in the modern world, that is critical. A modern jurist must be well informed of what happens to street children. What percentage of street children go into the organ trade, where they have the organs harvested? What percentage of street children are sexually abused and go into pornography, pedophilia, sex trade? How can a Muslim sit there and say, oh, haram, adopt an orphan? And I know for a fact, from the work I do in human trafficking, that European tourists and American tourists go to a country like Egypt specifically to have sex with children. Because they pay off the cops and they take the street children and have sex with them. And these are filmed. And then they are sold all over Europe and the US. And then some idiot faqih sits there and tells me, oh, haram, you can't adopt. Okay, find the solution then. Get off your fat butt and go find the solution. I talk about living jurisprudence. it needs a ferocious moral inventory. You know, a jurist that is dishonest is not worthy of being called a jurist, or a jurist who's not well informed, doesn't know what's going on in the world, doesn't have a clue of what happens in the world. That's not a jurist, that's not a faqih. It's contrary to the very idea of fiqh and what a faqih should be. So that, now that, the issue of the attrition, and a good example of this is like the beating verse in the Quran, right? I wrote a chapter in not the thing that I'm talking about, where I talk about the beating verse. A chapter in the conference of the books, one of my books, called the Book of Suspended Judgment. What there, and it's part of the dynamic that when we teach our children literalism in approaching text. In other words, we tell them things like, you know, the Quran is a very simple book. All you have to do is open it and read it, and you get everything. Then they believe us, and then they learn that approach to text, and they read it, and then they see something that they don't like about testimony of women or beating and so on, and no amount of apologetics appeals to them, and they quit. It's very different that if you teach them, you know, texts are a complex being. There are parts of the text which actually the Quran actually says, parts of the text that can be easily understood by everyone, and there are parts of the text that need in-depth research and knowledge, because that text is not all the same. It requires that we often would be able, and as you know, a lot of imams have a hard time admitting to their congregation that they don't know everything, so you know they have a hard time saying that to their people. But why do I mention this? Because we need to teach our children that when they encounter something that rubs with a sense of morality, not to deny their sense of morality and not to assume that they know everything they know about the text, but to say, suspend judgment. Take anchor yourself in what you know to be the truth, that Allah is beautiful, that Allah is Rahman Rahim, is merciful, that is what you anchor to be the truth. Now, as to why do you have something that sounds like you can beat your wife, and sounds? Or why do you have something that necessitated women inherit half of men inherit in some circumstances, and so on? Reserve, suspend judgment about that. Just say, I can't give you an answer that will convince you because it's a complicated matter, and reserve judgment until you have the opportunity to either research it or talk to a specialized scholar in these issues. That teaching our children to respect the richness of the tradition might actually save their faith, because then they're not just making these quick, snappy judgments that blow back in our face. We teach our children Islam is so easy, anyone can learn it. They go to the mosque, they see these imams that are basically medical doctors and doing they on their, as an extracurricular hobby, they go to the basically the masjid on weekends and give khutbahs and give lectures, and then some medical doctor or an engineer or whatever do tafsir of the Quran, and then they say, okay, well, if they can do it, I can do it, and then they confront these verses And the minute you tell them, well, it's complicated, and don't think that just because you read it and it sounds like that, that defines your faith, they look at you skeptically. Oh, like you're trying to pull one over me, because everything I've learned from my childhood is that anyone can interpret the Quran and anyone can read the Quran, and it's very, and even when the Imam does it, the chairman of the board does it, everyone around me does it, so why are you going to complicate things when it comes to me? And then they become unsalvageable. You really no longer can reach them. And that has been, consistently my experience. The kids, even the kids who grew up in Sufi families that have learned humility from a young age, they have a lower rate of attrition than kids that have grown up in a sort of Salafi-oriented families that tell them everything is accessible, just at the, like a push of the button pretty much. They have a much higher rate of attrition. Allahu A'lam.
3:40. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for coming.
What a pleasure and honor. Thank you so much. And safe travels back.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Until next time, inshallah.
Inshallah.
May
Come
Allah allow us
visit
to
us
meet
soon.
again.
Yeah.
Inshallah, inshallah. I missed Princeton days, but it's a days of youth. Long gone.